Okay. Hi, everyone. I just want to go ahead and introduce our speaker here today. This is Miss Aurelia Sands-Bell. We are so grateful to her for being here today to speak about this very important topic. So thank you so much, Ms. Sands-Bell, for being here. So Ms. Sands-Bell holds a Master of Education in Community Counseling from Georgia State University. In 2018, she joined Medical University of South Carolina faculty as a research instructor in the National Crime Victim Research and Treatment Center, working on the National Mass Violence and Victimization Resource Center project. The mission of the NMVRC is to strengthen the nation's capacity to serve victims and survivors of mass violence incidences through research, planning, training, technology, and collaboration. Ms. Sands-Bell is also the Vice President of the Board of Directors for End Violence Against Women International, with extensive experience in teaching and training related to victim services and advocacy. Prior to her current position, Ms. Sands-Bell was the Executive Director of several community-based nonprofits in Georgia addressing gender-based violence and has served on many national and local crisis response teams. She is the recipient of several awards and honors, including the U.S. Presidential Award for Outstanding Service and Commitment to Crime Victims. So it is our great pleasure and with a lot of gratitude, we introduce Ms. Sands-Bell, and please take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your invitation today, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about human trafficking. And it's a crime of exploitation. And throughout this presentation, I will be sharing with you information that may be very challenging for some to hear. So I want you to kind of take care of yourself as you hear about what's going on in the world as it relates to human trafficking. It's a terrible and it's a tough subject to talk about, tough subject to live through. So my goal today is to help you learn more about what defines human trafficking, talk to you more about some of the elements of human trafficking, talk about just how prevalent it is, and then a little bit more about the role of healthcare in identifying and helping these victims. So there's some basic definitions that I wanted to kind of put up for you today, and that is that human trafficking is the practice of exploiting adults and children for use as commodities or objects in conditions of sexual and labor servitude. And I think it's important that we hear those words, and I've bolded them on the screen because I want you to get that people are being used as commodities or as options. It's an illegal trade in human beings. It's done through recruitment or abduction by means of force, fraud, or coercion. And the purpose for doing this is for forced labor, debt bondage, or sexual exploitation. I'm going to start now with a video that is done by the Office for Victims of Crime, just to kind of give you a little bit of background.
My trafficker was my husband. There was no way I could reach out to anybody for help.
We're scared. We're scared to run. We're scared to tell anybody what's going on.
It was an incredibly violent situation. I felt like there was no way I could get out.
It was awful. Whole experience.
I was full-time babysitter and house cleaning, cooking. I wasn't getting paid. I was lied to, I was abused. I didn't know I was a victim of human trafficking until I told my story.
Human trafficking is really compelling someone to any form of work or service against their will.
Force, fraud, and coercion is really the crux of the crime.
human traffickers can be just about anyone from any walk of life. Owners of small businesses, head of a household. A lot of the trafficking involves domestic servitude. Hoteliers, restaurant owners, owners of massage parlors, agricultural farm owners.
It can be a trafficker who tells a woman, I want to be your boyfriend, I love you, and if you love me, you're going to go out and have sex for money. It can be kind of psychological like that, or it can be more overt, more physical. It can be hitting, abusing, keeping them away from any support systems.
They may have their documents taken away from them, their passport, things like that, and they're sort of held in a way that makes them fearful to complain. And if they do complain, then they're fired.
One myth about trafficking is that it involves people being smuggled in containers across borders. Smuggling is a crime against a border. Trafficking is a crime against a person.
I still see this attitude of it's just immigrants or it's just people in other countries. It happens to US citizens so much more than people are aware.
There really is no one profile of a trafficked person. There are clearly themes or patterns, but if you look through the investigation reports, you'll see cases that are very, very diverse.
Trafficking, it doesn't know any boundaries. And it happens all over America. So I came from kind of a more privileged background, but it still happened to me and a male. The victim can be male, female, transgendered, anyone.
There is a myth out there, partly because of movies, that trafficking victims are chained up, and that's not the case, but it doesn't make the victim any less unable to leave. Oftentimes they're worried for their family members. Traffickers will often say, I know people that will do things to them.
We need to understand that freedom of movement does not equal freedom of choice. Most of the time, being trapped is something we can't see. It's something that the trafficker pinpoints as a vulnerability and is able to use against the victim.
You're initially brainwashed, and then over a period of time, you become conditioned where you start to accept that this is all you can do.
The natural stakeholders in this issue are certainly law enforcement, legal advocates, social service providers. There's other players involved as well.
It is important to engage the community in human trafficking cases because victims often don't self-identify. They don't come forward to law enforcement.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We try to make sure the community is educated regarding human trafficking because those citizens in the community are the eyes and the ears.
It's medical workers, it's educators, it's personnel at homeless shelters.
There has to be a support system within the community, psychological counseling, shelter, and vocational education so they can reintegrate, become a healthy individual.
We can't do this alone. No one has the capacity to provide every single thing that a victim or survivor of human trafficking needs.
There's an intentional effort to get everyone together so we know how to share resources, we know how to work together and to make sure at the end of the day, a victim becomes a survivor.
This video was intended to give you this a good look, high level look at what human trafficking is. And I hope that you were able to see the differences in the people, their gender, their race, their ethnicity, just so many different ways people show up. And yet they were victims of human trafficking, but the video in this particular instance doesn't tell you what form of trafficking victimization they suffered. but it does let you know just how prevalent this issue is. There are a lot of terms for what we call it. It's a modern slavery. It's trafficking in persons, forced labor, involuntary servitude, sexual servitude, and prostitution. You also hear terms like forced marriage when you have young kids forced to marry someone who's older than they are so that they have the benefit of coming into the country. And again, globally, there were over 15 million people in 2016 forced into these types of relationships. There is forced criminal activity, and that occurs when a person is coerced or deceived into carrying out crimes such as drug trafficking, pickpocketing, bag snatching, ATM theft. As a part of coercion to, I'm not going to hurt your family if you do this. If you do that, I'll make sure your family gets in here, or this is taken care of, whatever. One of the problems that we faced in the community that I worked in was a kind of a combination of these things where families had come into the country and they were suffering in poverty. Well, older men would come and say, well, let me just spend time with your family. Well, then it became, let me just spend time with this family member. And often it was young girls who were taken out, sexually assaulted and abused, and money paid to the family. So it kept the family, gave them the money that they needed, but this young girl's being was now compromised by these kinds of relationships. And in some cases, they were indeed married off to these individuals. In some countries, we look at children who are under the age of 18 who are recruited as soldiers and are in actual combat. And they are, in this case, these kinds of cases, considered victims of trafficking and exploitation. Just again, another high level look at just how prevalent the problem is. Globally, 40 million victims are trapped in what we are calling modern day slavery. And of that portion, almost 25 million of them are in forced labor of some sort, and another 15 million in forced marriages. Modern slavery, if you look at it statistically, we're talking about 5.1 victims of modern slavery for every 1,000 people in the world. It's a astounding thought. And to top it off, 1 in 4 victims of modern slavery are children. Children are trapped in this web of deceit. Just again, I'm not going to get into all of it because you'll have access to the PowerPoint and some other things that I want to provide to you at the end of our time. But just to let you know that it's forced labor in the private economy, and it generates an estimated $150 billion in illegal profits every year. It's the largest share of labor trafficked adults. They are in they work as domestic workers, and they work in construction, they work in manufacturing and agriculture and fishing sectors of our economy. And the biggest group are the migrant workers and indigenous people who are particularly vulnerable to forced labor. Women and girls show up in this crime, and they show up disproportionately affected at a rate of about 71%. 3.8 million adults are trafficked or forced into sexual exploitation. And again, about 1 million children are trafficked for commercial sexual exploitation. So when you see and hear about pictures of children and child pornography, these are the kinds of ways kids are being exploited. This is just a map that I found, and I thought it was interesting just to look at the hot points across the country where trafficking occurs. Now, it doesn't mean that trafficking isn't in some of the countries that are not really, in quote, lit up. It just means that the reporting isn't as substantial, but it's across our country. The FBI reported in 2019 and 20, their numbers are kind of running together now for a bit, but 46 states reported at least one offense related to human trafficking. And that is to the FBI. That is not to the hotline where people are calling themselves and asking for help and wanting to get out. That's just kind of what the numbers, how they play out to the FBI. There were 550 state prison admissions during this time for human trafficking, and about 1,500 persons were in the custody of the state prison serving sentences for human trafficking. And portions of Mississippi and Ohio do not have a mandatory reporting system as of the time that I did this research. I'm hoping that that has since changed. That's a scary thought. Now, there are a lot of myths and misconceptions about what trafficking is or is not, but there's a myth that it's always or usually a violent crime, and it doesn't have to be. It can be that the psychological hold that these individuals have on people is so great that that's what they have, and they don't have to inflict physical harm in order to control their victims. And I'm going to tell you a story about a particular case, but it really probably is more about physical. But all human trafficking involves commercial sex, but that's not true, because worldwide, that's what we thought. But experts believe that there are more labor trafficking issues than sex trafficking, believe it or not. And it's often thought that only girls and women can be victims and survivors, but we saw on that tape that that's not true. Boys are also victimized by these crimes. And one of the young men that was in that video was a young man who was, it happened as a part of his church and his ministry. And there was a clique of men that he had to be sexually involved with, or they made threats against his family. And it just was mind-blowing, because again, this young man was in church and he was a child at the time and trusted the adults that he was with. Human trafficking, it's thought involves moving or traveling or transporting people across state lines or across national borders. And that's not true. There is a difference between smuggling, as you heard in the video, and trafficking. Human smuggling is a crime against the border, and trafficking doesn't require that a person be moved out of their community or even out of their own homes. They can be recruited and they can be trafficked right within their own homes. There are other myths like it's only happens in illegal or underground industries. Well, that's not true, because there's some businesses that are, well known within the community where trafficking has been reported and prosecuted, like our restaurants, cleaning services, our construction sites, or our factories. It's also believed that people being trafficked are physically unable to leave their situations. And as I said, that's not true. Sometimes the reasons that they stay in that situation is complex. They might lack what it takes to get out. They might lack the mental capacity to get out, the resources to get out. They stay in situations that are unsafe, but are known to them, rather than to move to another situation where they don't know if they'll be safe and they don't know if they'll be taken care of. And some of those people have been manipulated, and some don't even understand that they are being controlled. Labor trafficking is only a primary problem in developing countries, and that's not so. And I'm going to share a case with you pretty soon about that. Trafficking targets victims that they don't know. Again, that's not true. One of the very first stories we heard was a woman who was trafficked by her husband. These trafficking occurs by romantic partners, as we said, spouses, family members, and as I said earlier, parents. There are elements of human trafficking, and they are force, fraud, coercion, okay? When you have those three elements, force either being physical, sexual isolation or confinement, fraud, again, false employment, we hear it all the time. You know, you're gonna make $100,000 on this job. Come work for me, and you work hours and hours and hours and don't get paid. Or they say, you know, we're gonna come here, live here, we'll put you up in a nice apartment within my home, and you know, you just, you know, take care of the children and you have your days off and blah, blah, blah. That doesn't happen because documents are taken and they can't go anywhere. Some might not even know the language. Coercion, there's threats of violence, threats of arrest and deportation, debt bondage, you owe me money, so you have to work this off. And then again, taking their documentation and their identification is a part of that coercion piece of those three elements. You heard the prosecutor talk about it: force, fraud, coercion. So there are ways that victims are brought into human trafficking. Some are abducted. Others are, so we hear about, a lot of times you hear about people who are missing. Some of them have been abducted and are either locked into human trafficking, either in this country or somewhere else. Traffickers will do things like advertise for modeling jobs. They want, and you know, young women, young men, they think that's easy money and I'll be a model. And the next thing they know, they're in a situation that's that they didn't think that they would ever be in. There could be a promise of marriage, education, employment. You know, people are seeking a better life and they get involved in these kinds of situations where they are exploited. You'll see lots of ads about working or studying abroad. Doesn't that sound great? Let me send you to Paris. You could study in Paris and all you have to do is, you know, maybe just take care of this family a couple days a week. Well, the next thing you know, you're again isolated from your family and you find yourself being taken advantage of. Some, again, as was said, are smuggled into the country or out of the country for a debt that's owed. And it's going to be paid. And how's it going to be paid? It's going to be paid in by a human in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And as I said earlier, parents are selling their children or intimate partner to traffickers. Most of us can't even conceive of doing that, but that happens on a day-to-day basis. I want to tell you about this story because I ran across it the other day, and I'm so happy to be able to give you an example, one that you could kind of see. And this is a story of a man named Chris. Chris is 43 years old. He's the article says captive no more, and it was in the Post and Courier in February of 2022. So it's extremely recent. It's in Conway, South Carolina, a little town outside of Myrtle Beach. Now, Myrtle Beach is a tourist area. It's beautiful beach along the coast of South Carolina. People come to every year to relax and have fun. And it's just a nice place to be. 15 miles up the road is this little town called Conway. And there was a restaurant there called the J&J, family-owned restaurant, that Chris had been working there since he was 12 years old. He dropped out of school. He was diagnosed by a psychologist as being mildly, educably, mentally retarded. So he had the mindset of a 9 to 10-year-old. He could do things, but that was his thinking level. Well, Chris worked at this place for years, and this was a family restaurant, so it was passed down to different family members. It was passed down to this one particular family member who was physically abusive to Chris. But he told Chris, he said, you know, I'm going to build you an apartment on the back of the restaurant. And he did. He built a room, no refrigerator, no stove, and he had to use the facilities in the restaurant, okay? And customers would hear Chris being cursed out, would hear and see Chris being slapped and hit and beat, and at least one known occasion, burned on the back of his neck with some tongs, you know, that you work with in the kitchen, dipped in hot oil and put to the back of his neck, and cursed out many, many times, racial slurs and other forms of degradation. People in the restaurant could hear this. And it's a place where prosecutors came to eat. It's a place where law enforcement on a regular basis came to sit and eat the soul food that was being cooked. And this young man was abused, and he got into trouble with the local law enforcement for some kind of drug offense, and apparently a low-level drug offense, more than likely marijuana, I'm guessing. And the guy who owned the restaurant said, I got you out of trouble, so now you owe me. And I built this room for you. You have to work that off. And he had him work for free 100+ hours a week for about 12 years. Now imagine it. No income. Every now and then he give him a couple dollars so he could get his hair cut, and he give him a couple dollars so he could buy some kind of snack that he liked. I can't remember. But he didn't have a life. And he was afraid because this man told him he was going to call the police, because the man had a brother on the police force. And he said, I'll call the police, they'll come back, arrest you, and take you to jail for the rest of your life. This young man stayed in that situation for about 12 years. There were a couple attempts to tell the authorities of what happened. But remember, you had authorities who were complicit. And when I say complicit, they knew it was happening, but it was just Chris. They called Chris slow. You had to beat him to make him do things. He deserved to be beat. He deserved whatever it was that he was getting. He was not allowed to talk to his family. They would come to see him. This man would not allow that to happen. And he said he was afraid to try to reach out to them because the man threatened the family as well. But a long story short, a very brave former employee reported it to local Department of Social Services. Nothing happened. 4 months went by, she reported it to the governor's office. The governor's office, at that time, Governor Haley, reported it to, sent a note to that county and said, we got this complaint, we need you to look into it. So that's when they looked into it and literally found this young man in the condition that he was in, and they said at that time he was very skinny, he had not been eating. He had post-traumatic stress disorder. He couldn't sleep at night. He was afraid that Chris was gonna, not Chris, the other guy was gonna come in on him at night. It was just really bad. Long story short, after years of going through the court process with it, they finally arrested the guy, and his charge was slavery. There was the first case that I found in South Carolina. He was charged with slavery, and he was sentenced to 10 years. He came back to court and said to Chris that it was like one of the times that they appeared in court, he said, "I'm a better man. I love you, Chris. I love you." Well, isn't that what they all kind of say, you know? But fortunately, Chris had a wonderful victim advocate, someone that I know who stayed with him, who stayed with the family, helped them get through that process. And this young man has been moved out of that situation and is now working for another restaurant and is starting to thrive. But he's had to have a lot of therapy around the issue of post-traumatic trauma. So it's still happening. And I thought that that was such a wow moment to see that he had been charged with slavery. And that charge was 2017. So it's been going through the court process all this time. So I want to say that a young man like Chris, who would not have been able to get medical care, he had medical issues, but he was not able to go and get medical treatment. But there are things that as healthcare professionals, you need to be thinking about. And I do want to say, traffickers didn't find COVID a problem. They figured out ways to work around it. They used a lot more savvy ways of recruitment, and they did in fact continue to get victims. Victims they have a lot of issues, as I said to you about Chris: malnourishment, sleep deprivation. He was victim of violence, not sexual assault, but physical violence. Others are victims of multiple rape encounters. And when you think about it, the encounters, the sexual encounters that they have on a day-to-day basis, that's rape every time that happens. That is against their will. And it's extreme stress that these people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Again, they have health problems. They have acquired multiple sexually transmitted diseases and infections. They're forced to have numerous abortions, usually through unsafe measures. A lot of anal and rape and tears as a result. And we don't think so much about the throat, but there can be a lot of throat trauma because of oral contact, as well as resulting in incontinence. These people don't have access to timely care. And again, because they're not allowed to see their doctors. They have broken bones, contusions, lots of dental problems, lots of tooth loss. And when you see that in young people and you're not asking the right questions, there's something wrong here. As you examine their bodies, you're looking to see if there's cigarette burns, a lot of injury. You start to ask them about what has happened. Again, high rates of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, dissociative identity disorder. Again, they're having to move outside of their body, so to speak, so that they can get through the violations, the number of times that they are being sexually assaulted. They have a lot of guilt. They have a lot of self-blame. They may have defied their parents by running away from home. And they have participated, many of them, in what's called survival sex. Just let me sleep here tonight. Well, in order to sleep here tonight, you got to give it up, okay? These are children who have been turned out often of foster care. And a lot of these perpetrators know where these homes are in communities and just start to hang out. And then they're picking up these kids, taking them to Burger King, taking them to the movies until they gain their confidence and they're involved. I want to have time to share with you a little bit of what the American Hospital Association is doing to combat human trafficking. And I'm going to move real quick.
In 2005, my daughter was missing for 11 months. I didn't know anything about human trafficking at the time. I recovered her 11 months later and found out that she had been victimized by human trafficking. Hospital leaders should understand that why you don't probably believe that you're servicing victims and survivors of human trafficking is simply because our community doesn't want to believe that this is happening. I understand it as a mother of a survivor. I'm not upset. I'm extremely grateful that we can have this dialogue.
By applying a public health approach and partnering with hospitals to transform the way that they respond and understand the patients that quite honestly they're already seeing, we can help to stop the increase in human trafficking or the steady flow of human trafficking and really look at starting to transform our communities, our individual staff, our families, so that we all live in a safer place.
Healthcare leaders must know that human trafficking exists in their communities, around the hospitals, around the healthcare facilities where they provide care. And the reason that that is so important is because many times victims of human trafficking come to their facilities for care.
You are already working with this population. They are in your systems, they are being reserved. Some of them are your staff, some of them are your children of your staff or your parents of your staff. We offer a robust human trafficking training program called SOAR to Health and Wellness. It's accredited. We partner with a multitude of organizations, including bringing in expertise from individuals with lived experience, survivors themselves, clinicians from all different types of practice, and service providers as well to develop these trainings. We're available to partner with you and support you. You don't have to walk it alone.
These survivors are truly in plain sight if we would just avail ourselves to open our systems in a budget neutral way. This is not about the money that the healthcare industry needs to spend for something else. This is about incorporating human trafficking in our dialogue and in our policies and our procedures.
Very good. I'm going to move a little quickly. This is the 10 red flags that help you know if your patient could be a victim. I'm going to provide that, and your team can make sure that you get all of this kind of information. But again, as she said, they're in plain sight, and it's not about money. It's just about how you properly identify and as a physician provide the care for these patients. Identifying human trafficking, we just kind of talk about some of this high level, but is the potential victim accompanied by another person who seems controlling? And does the person accompany that a potential victim insist on giving the information rather than that victim giving the information? Are you able to see or detect any type of physical abuse? Is that person fearful, behaving in a fearful manner? And does the potential victim have trouble communicating because of language or cultural barriers? Now, most of our hospitals have the capacity to provide people who are able to help with linguistics, and we need to be able to use that. Does the potential victim have any identification? Because sometimes, remember we said, that's taken. There are barriers to it, identifying them because it's a hidden crime. They're well coached by their trafficker, and they can be charged with some crimes themselves. And that's one of the things that they're told. If you tell on me, I'm going to tell that you did blah, blah, blah. And sometimes people don't even see themselves in a position as being trafficked. There are barriers for immigrant victims. There's that fear of deportation, again, the language and economic barriers. There's a lack of protection in their home country. And again, for their family members who are at home in whatever country that is. And there's misinformation about their rights and their services that they can get here. They don't know that what's happened to them is against the law. Just to show you a couple of the tags and taggings and the tattoos that are on some victims, you'll see this is like what you see in a grocery store. it's that kind of mark. It's, again, the commodification of a human being. You see crowns and chains like this one. Just all kinds of ways. They even put their names, as you see, on victims. Incredible. There's a little bit of terminology I want to remind you, just tell you about. There's the battered child syndrome. For any person less than 18 years old, refer to them as children. Don't use and call them teens or adolescents, because their childhood and adolescence has been taken. This is a term that that you don't want to say to children. In other words, you don't want to call a child prostitute. That's not true. Don't ever use that word. Children cannot consent to being in a situation of prostitution. They don't have that ability. They don't have that emotional, psychological ability to consent to being in that type of environment. No matter what they say, they can't consent, so that they're not prostitutes. Commercial sex exploitation of children is, again, the most underreported form of child abuse. And intimate partner violence, when we talk about IPV, we are talking about people who are 18 and older. Anything else is an abusive situation, battered child syndrome. A minor does not have equality. Now, when you ask victims, and talk to them about drug abuse, that's to think you're abusing drugs. Some, you just want to ask about drug use. Are you using any drugs? Because sometimes they're forced to take drugs so they can be controlled, and then they become addicted. And others use the drugs to cope with the devastation of what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Again, talking about a collaborative team in your hospitals, you have medical, dental specialists, social workers, therapists, counselors, victim advocates. Anybody should form a team in working on these cases, because it's going to take a team to be able to observe what's happening and ask the right questions, and then follow up with the right help. And most of you have heard about the adverse childhood experiences, so I won't talk a lot about that. But again, that 0 to 7 years, about the horrible things that happen and how that impacts people as they move forward in their lives. And of course, trafficking is one of them. A lot of adverse childhood experiences are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, substance use and abuse, and all kinds of problems as they grow older. So think about those kinds of things and help people to think and process about the things that they've experienced, because they will impact. The thing about it, ACEs can be prevented. The number of adverse childhood experiences can be prevented. I'm not going to get a whole bunch into that, but that's a sign that, when somebody's in trouble, they can, and Canada has used this to signal for help. And it's reportedly something that happened in the United States. A young woman was able to give that signal, and someone saw it, and they were able to help her and rescue her. So at this time, again, I feel real rushed doing it, but if anyone has any questions, if there's anything anybody wants to talk about, I have a number of resources that I have put on the slides that you'll be able to avail yourselves of, as well as a couple additional PowerPoints. Additional handouts that I'll include. If there are any questions, if not.
I have two questions actually, and this was, just such wonderful and helpful information. I think, it's very obvious in how you pointed out, screening for things that I wouldn't have thought about, or symptoms or atypical presentations that I'll be looking out for. One question I have to follow up is, if they're meeting these symptoms, if we're medical students and we have these concerns, how do you ask someone, or how do you bring up the possibility that they are being trafficked?
Yeah, I think that can be very challenging to do, but I think you kind of just, you don't say, are you being trafficked? Because sometimes people don't know what that means. Are you able to make decisions for yourself? And can you tell me who is this individual, whatever? The thing that I really also want to help you see is that, remember that team of people, that collaborative team? You don't have to do it all yourself. You can step out and call for a social worker and ask, I'm concerned about this client. Can you help me talk to him or her, whoever it might be? And they can do that. They can help you have a conversation and let them know that they're, you don't have to, be in this situation. We can help you. There are resources, and it is hard to ask, and you can own your own discomfort. I'm sorry to have to ask you, this is kind of hard, but I'm concerned about you. I'm seeing burns, and I'm seeing, dental problems. I'm seeing a lot of injury. And for a 20-year-old to have the kind of, anal or vaginal tears that I'm seeing, it just makes me really concerned about what might be happening to you. And I always just kind of say to people that I'm so sorry that all of this is happening. And I want to help you. I want to help you. I want to help you get out and know that there is a way to get out of this. And so I thank you so much for asking, because I know it's hard. But remember, you have a team that can help you get through it. When you take that course that's through the Hospital Association, they get a little bit more in depth about those kinds of things. So I really encourage people to invite that kind of training into their hospital settings so that they can get that more in-depth kind of help that they need.
Ms. Sansfeld, yeah, just to echo what Alana said, thank you so much for sharing this talk. I think it's so important, and you touched on what is obviously a really difficult but essential area for us as future healthcare professionals. So thank you so much for sharing this. I also had a question just kind of about your role as a victim advocate and like what that entails for you, what your, how you establish trust with your with the survivors that you meet and things like that.
So right now, I am not going into the hospital like we used to go in, because I'm now doing a different kind of project. But in the past, and working in a rape crisis center, whenever there was a call that there was a victim like this, we would probably be the ones that would be called. And so we go in and we would identify who we were and let them know that about the resources that they had, the concern that the doctors generally had for what they were experiencing. So generally, if they called us, that meant that they really felt like it was at that level, or the victim had acknowledged it. And so when they call us, ours is to say to them, here, you don't have to go back there. We've got a place for you. We can take you into our shelter, or we can move you into a shelter that's in another community so that you're safe, that kind of thing. So the role of the advocate is very, very hands-on, and it's answering questions and helping them to think about the next steps. And next steps might mean reporting to law enforcement, but for some it doesn't. They're not ready to make that report. But you have to work with people where they are, and it means if you're not ready today, that's okay. We can make an anonymous report. We can do whatever, and they're told about all of their options. And if going to law enforcement at that time is too frightening, then they don't have to do that. Our services are not contingent upon them reporting to law enforcement. Our services are about them getting the help and support that they need. So it's starting a chain of here we are today, here's some emergency services, and then here's some long-term services that you might need. That means housing and counseling and going back to school, or even sending you back to your parents if that's, if you would, are here without their consent and you need to get back home, you need a bus ticket, let's send you back home to your mom if that's a safe place to be. So it's a lot of different things that the victim advocate's role is a little unique because we get to be involved with the court and legal system as well as kind of social services part. It's kind of a nice blend of all of that. I've enjoyed being able to have all of that kind of contact.
It sounds like you really are such a liaison between the different kind of collaborators in making sure survivors are well cared for. And I think your point about just, meeting a survivor where they are and not pushing any particular thing instantly is so well taken, just because I feel like it really emphasizes the need to keep these people plugged into care and connected to individuals who can help them longitudinally. So even outside of just like the acute setting. So I think that was a really important point.
Absolutely. Wherever a victim shows up, there ought to be the appropriate response. Wherever they show up, there ought to be the appropriate response. Someone responded and reached out for this young man, Chris, in a restaurant, a family-owned restaurant. And I didn't tell y'all, this guy was ordered to pay restitution of about a little over $500,000 to this young man. Now, the reality is, will he ever get it? Not likely, but that debt has to be paid first. When this man gets out of prison and starts to work, that debt has to be paid. But they also came and charged the family business. So the business had to pay too. So he's got some restitution and some restitution coming his way, I hope very soon. Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be here tonight and tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Whenever we do this, but thank you so much.
This was so helpful.
And we really look forward to seeing the resources that you share with us as well. And we'll make sure that is shared with our viewers who couldn't be here. So thank you again so much, Ms. Sansbell.